that in some ways, though some people who would probably be interested in this may be away, on the other hand, it's also a time when things are a little bit more quiet, and it's always good to find places that are out of the heat as well. So this is an important issue. It's one we wanted to make sure you were all here for. Clearly, security cooperation is high on the agenda of both governments in Mexico and the United States. It is one of the issues that President Obama and President Calderon will be speaking about, I'm sure, on Sunday, and I'm sure we'll be speaking with Prime Minister Harper about as well in the trilateral meeting that starts Sunday night and then Monday morning. It is an area that has been characterized by both governments where there is great co-responsibility in causes and co-responsibility in solutions. And we are at a moment where we are talking with each other about ways that we address this in new ways, in ways that deal with both northbound flows, southbound flows, institution building in both countries, greater forms of cooperation than we have in the past. We've been very fortunate to have with us Sigrid Arzt, who was National Security Advisor to President Calderon. She has a distinguished history in government in a couple different times, as well as in academia and as well as in nonprofit world, in non-governmental organizations. And she is really the person who's put this meeting together today, I should say. She's been looking at the issues of transparency and security. One of the areas that as you will hear shortly, is fundamental to creating a security regime that works, to creating public security in Mexico is how do you make sure that the apparatus is also accountable to citizens? How do you make sure that the relationship between Mexico and the United States is accountable to citizens in both countries, that information flows in the right ways that both protect the identities of those involved and the strategic needs of the countries, but at the same time it makes sure that it's accountable to citizens and transparent to citizens in ways that it needs to be. We're very fortunate to have with us Maria Marvan, who has spoken here before and is a good friend of the Center, former president of the IFAI and counselor of the IFAI. Let me give you, I guess, a brief introduction to both and turn it over to them. Sigrid is currently a public policy scholar here at the Center. She'll be with us for another 3 weeks. We've been very fortunate to have her here for 2 months. She was previously National Security Advisor to President Felipe Calderon. She was also the executive director and founder of Democracy, Human Rights, and Security, an organization that worked on security and human rights issues. She has consulted with a variety of organizations. I think you all have her bio. But she was also significantly, she's taught also a great deal in the past. And she also served as Chief of Staff to Attorney General Lozano Gracia in the 1990s, a very important position, the time of initial political openings in Mexico. Maria Marvan Laborde is a commissioner of the Federal Institute for Access to Information. She was also significantly what we would call in English, I think, the president of the IFAI, or the chair of the council, during the critical first 2 years that the IFAI began to operate, and was crucial in setting up a lot of the way that the transparency law works in Mexico today. She spoke here when she was president of the council, as a matter of fact, a while back. She is also an academic by training, and she has taught at the University of Guadalajara. She was a counselor for the Federal Electoral Institute in Jalisco, and has held a number of other positions that are in her bio. So we're very pleased to have both Sigrid and Maria with us. Before I turn over to them, let me recognize a couple people. Diana Negroponte, who's part of the advisory board of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Luz Maria de la Mora, I saw over there, who we're very fortunate to have here as a public policy scholar this summer as well, working on issues of South-South cooperation, how Mexico works with other countries in the region, and whether there is a pending agenda in Mexico. So anyone's interested in that might want to talk with Luz Maria. Pleased to see Duncan Wood somewhere here, who's the chair of the Department of International Relations at ITAM, who's a fellow at CSIS these days, and glad to have you in Washington. And I'm sure many other people I'm forgetting to recognize. So glad to have all of you here. And Sigrid, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Andrew, and thank Maria to be with us. What I'll do this morning with you is share how early stages we are in understanding the equilibrium between guarding national security and understanding national security, but at the same time being transparent on some of the issues that the national security apparatus has. And there are a series of values that go into the security world, which is basically, as a core value, is secrecy. So how do you strike the balance between a sector that naturally works with secrets and does policies and engages in producing efforts, but that at the same time can remain accountable to its people and its bureaucratic and its bureaucracy. So I'll take you through some of the things that I think we are still seeing at the very early stages, but that we need to see ahead on how we assure that they transcend the administrations, given the investment that the federal state have been doing in managing information, and how we see other partners in the process of securing better our communities. You have to be aware that only until very recently a national security law was passed in Mexico, only simply in the year 2005. And the creation of this law has had as its origin give the legal protection to the main intelligence agency in Mexico, which is the civil servant intelligence known by CISEN. No, at the time there was very little discussion, public discussion about the law, but also about how many of the things that had been produced in the different agencies across the security community, which is not only the CISEN, but it's the military, it's public security, it's the Attorney General. You get to protect and preserve historically the documents that you have. No? And so at that time it was important to have a discussion together with experts on national security, because there were intents to go even beyond, and Maria will remember this, even to go beyond the protection of some information, because it was national security beyond the 12 years. And the argument from those involved in the discussions was the law has established that it's 12 years, and if there are remaining risks by disclosing that information, then you should secure another 12 years, which will mean 22 years. But we have to also grasp the idea that we are coming from a legacy where the security apparatus, the line between distinguishing what was protecting the interest of the state and protecting the permanence of a type of regime was very blurred. And building up professionalization bodies that would preserve the protection of information became very critical. When I had the opportunity to work at the Attorney General, and that was basically very few years ago, 15 years ago, I was shocked that when I took custody of the appointment that was taking place, nothing was given to me in terms of documents. There was no follow-up. And I was surprised, because you would think that in an agency like the Attorney General, you would have files, building files and documents and preserving those things. And that varies across, historically had varied across our bureaucracies in terms of how each bureaucracy had developed its own system. So it was very important to start establishing, from changes in government, the institutional memory. Some agencies in the security apparatus have gone through the process very well, for obvious reasons, because they're promoting a strong career-based institution like the military, and the Navy. The CISEN has done its job. Some areas of the Ministry of Interior, certainly the foreign policy. But then you have new agencies that are coming to be new players within the security community that, between the changes and their ongoing process of construction, are also new to the handling of information. So having said that, you should also be aware that when society approaches the national security community in Mexico, is usually labeled as something that is secretive, but with a pepper of abuse of power. There are very little bridges that have been built to create venues of understanding and dialogue, so there's a considerable degree of mistrust. And very importantly, we are coming into addressing a challenge like the one we all read every single day, which is the organized crime that's frontally challenging the Mexican state, but at the same time, not all our federal bureaucracy has an understanding of what security means in terms of managing sensitive information, securing the identity of the people that are at risk, fighting these persons, guarding. We basically, and I know Maria will go through that, we basically have 3 types of classifications, which is public, confidential, and reserved. So even in the security arena, you wouldn't have levels like top secret, secret information, and then you will have areas where you will have personnel that is vetted, that have gone through checks, clearances, that know how to handle and classify sensible information, but then you will have other pockets of the federal bureaucracy that don't go through those procedures, and with whom you at times need to share information. So how far you go in understanding the dialogue and the connections between that. Now, having said that, there are signs in the road that show us how there has been an ongoing process of institutionalization that has allowed each one of the agencies to build up a historical background on the documents that they built for the process of decision making, which you couldn't find, or was extremely hard to find a decade ago. And that I can also share with you in terms that when I was appointed to the position, I had to take sign custody of a specific documents that were handled to me, that they were sensible, but they will have a continuation. So that already talked about the permanency of using and protecting information, but at the same time learning what of that information had to be disclosed. Now, in the context where we find each other, I think that there are remaining challenges, for example, on handling critical information that can give us a good idea of how much improvement or what is the landscape out there. An example of that is crime statistics, no? And it's usually very hard to get crime statistics. Crime statistics of common crime, homicide, burglary are statistics that are built at the local level. And the federal government has done an effort to build up that information. Today, for the first time, we will have a commission at the National Security the Council of the National Public Security, where they will establish the guidelines, how the information is going to be gathered, how it's going to be collected, how that is going to be changing in time. And it is important, this commission, because you have the representation of the 32 state governors in that commission that would allow for probably the first time do a systematic effort of gathering information that will go into the electronic database known as Plataforma Mexico, you know? So in the foreseeable future, you have a commission that will start reviewing and systematically capturing data that is critical to see the changes in crime, to see if policies are working or not working, but that would allow also to the public to have access to critical data that has become almost a challenge to get there. It is also important to say that within the security community, given the levels and asymmetries that exist between the different agencies that are involved in the national security arena, you also have to learn and articulate bridges of trust. And so in a first phase, you create those bridges of trust among the agencies of the federal government, of the 2 levels of government, which is state and municipal. But in addition, today, we are challenged every day with sharing that with our borders, you know. And it's important that as we move along in institutionalizing the processes, that we establish regulations, that we also protect the identity of those that participate in operations or in investigations that are extremely sensible. At the same time, they are those that can oversee and make sure that the information or the operations don't go as far as to that affect the efficiency of the responsibilities of the state. It is assumed traditionally that everyone would understand the same thing. And you have to remember that Mexico is very new also to a civil service across its federal bureaucracy. So it is important to see how dialogue between EFI and the federal comptroller, which is the Función Pública, has to engage in making sure that the custody of the documents, the custody of budgets, the custody of a number of things keep on going, and you have the proper regulatory frameworks. I think that you have out there, but needs to be potentialized, escalated, is the external oversight, because today the national security apparatus can be held accountable by the bicameral commission in Congress and Senate. And those in the intelligence community and the security apparatus are called in by this commission, which is similar. It's a picture depicted from the committees that you have in intelligence in Congress. And what you are looking there is that you will have in the near future specialization on your members that can grab a good idea of a specific threats and improve the understanding of what's challenging the state, but playing a role of balancing and striking what are the values of democracy to rest accountable to others. The other new very interesting venue in Mexico is the extra parliamentary oversight. And I think that there's where many connections are being put in place by different actors in society. That's where you have the hands of the media, you have NGOs participating, you have citizens engaged in understanding how far the state is capable of committing itself in the compromises that it's establishing. And let's take the example of the National Accord for Security, Justice and Legality that was signed in August of year 2008. At that time, the accord had 74 compromises, of which it shared levels of responsibility with the state and the municipal authorities, but at the same time had additional partners, had NGOs, had the media, had the business sector. So it was important to bring together a dialogue and establish the partnership of how we would keep track of who was doing what and the benchmarks of improvement. In doing that, it was important to bring in the IFI and another very important institution of the Mexican government, which was the one that builds up the statistics, was INEGI, the Statistics and Geographic National Institute. Why? Because these are areas of expertise that know already how, on the one hand, build up statistics, and on the other one, work with not protecting information, but making sure that the information that's out there can become reserved or not. So you see more and more actors that serve in the security apparatus as oversights. What remains critical, to wrap up, that we need to find ways, and we have to institutionalize the process of systematizing public information. We need to learn and to become accustomed and accommodated in the security apparatus that this is an ongoing process where you have obligations, that it runs vertical and horizontal. It is automatically assumed that bureaucracies, they are all aware of the kinds of documents or the kinds of information that's shared. But remember, these are institutions that pride themselves of holding information in parcels, so that at the end, when you come to bodies where you have different representations, what you build up is a puzzle to understand what is being challenged. No, I think that you also, while you're building the guidelines of security and of improving the exchange of sensitive information, you're able to establish benchmarks that would allow you to improve the trust. Because in the security, and given the levels of challenges that you are faced today, building trust among partners and transnationally become critical to improve the capacity of both states to tackle those that are the enemies that harm the society. We today remain very fragile in protecting those that produce certain information that is sensible, because we don't have these different degrees. So at some point we will need to move to the discussion of creating other kinds of classification. We also need to bring the security apparatus to sit down and understand much better what are the limits to secrecy, so that you remain accountable to society and to other sectors of society. And I think that, and Maria has been a witness to this, there was a number of meetings that were taking place through an interagency effort between security and EFI and other members to have a dialogue and understand each side of the coin, and to improve the capacity of those to disclose information that by definition they would consider secret. So in that sense, you would see in the future that we are placing more and more institutionalization process, but that the challenge that rests ahead is how they transcend the next administration, that everything that has been built up in terms of gathering information, technological investment, the building of trust and capacity between one agency and another, remains for whoever comes and transcends to the next administration, and it's not change, so that we continue in the direction of building up the institutional memory of our national security institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sigrid. That's great. Maria.
Thank you very much. I have to. You will have to excuse my English is a little bit rusty, because I haven't been in the United States for a while, but I hope it's not so bad. Before I start, I would like to make two important remarks. FOIA in Mexico started just recently in 2003, and that gives the opportunity of to any citizen, actually to any person, to ask questions to the federal government. It's a paradox that we first have FOIA without having before any kind of law that allowed bureaucracy to lawfully reserve information. That doesn't mean the information was available. That means that every single bureaucrat or politicians can reserve whatever they please in the way they please, and usually the best way was putting the documents through the shredder. So that makes you a feeling of what a difficult problem we were when we start. There were and there are still very few rules on how to keep information, not reserve, how to keep information, how to keep documents, and how to reserve documents. Having said that, I will talk to you today about two different things. How FOIA had an influence in some kind of public policies about keeping and giving information to the public in the matter of national and public security. We have a very specific study that goes analyze all the appeals from 2003 until August 2008, and then what is actually our present conflict with the executive in terms of national security, especially after Calder starts the very heavy war on drugs from 2007 until now. Now, I think. Okay. I will talk a little bit about national and public security, much centered in public security, even though I'm absolutely sure that organized crime as narcotraffic is a matter not just of public security, but national security also. I took the liberty to talk more about public security, and of course it includes organized crime, as far as we are not talking about like foreign menace to the security in Mexico. In matters of public security, the executive has some kind of intervention in prevention, prosecution, and the system of jails, which is sanctions and a process to readapt society. So the request of FOIA from the people that has to do with public security are just in those areas and not others. Of course, there is always a question that is nothing new, not specific to Mexico. It is recognized, the main question, if there is a tension between transparency and access to public information and the state capability to guarantee public and national security. There are a lot of scholars, among them Alder Roberts, but there are that in most cases, or at least in some cases, transparency increases security and not the contrary. That hasn't been understood in Mexico, I must say. And it's been said that good levels of transparency and access to public information strengthen the government abilities to provide security. We are not in this phase yet. There are a lot of conflict. There are a lot of fearness from the bureaucracy. If I give up information, I will be vulnerable. On the other hand, as Sigrid said, and that's something that we have shared a lot of times as colleagues, as scholars, that we know each other like at least a decade ago, and after we become appointed in very different but complementary kind of work doing for the executive. The other problem is that there are very low standards in the management of information. So many times they will tell you in the executive offices, I cannot release that because the harm will be awful. And if you look into the web, you find the information, they don't want to release it. Many times. And it's not rare that sometimes even their own agency put the information in the web, but from other bureaucrat office. Those are very well known, the Johannesburg principles, in which they strengthen and promote that there has been transparency, especially among security and public and national security information. If I, in Mexico and FOIA from 2003, states some kind of principles. It states that the information is public by definition and reserved just by exception. There was supposed that the bureaucrat have to review the information document by document in order to establish what should be reserved, for how long, and under what reason. We have strengthened a lot the logical analysis of the harm test. If I release this document in particular, what harm could do to the societies as opposed to public interest? If there is no logical explanation and logical harm, then we are supposed to release the information. If the information must be reserved, we have to be sure that you are protecting public interest and not political or bureaucratic interest. A lot of time, the agencies becomes jealous, especially for information that is sensitive for the minister, for example, but not really for public security. A very simple example is when you ask how much money spends the minister in the trip to Washington, D.C., and they say, oh no, this is a very sensitive information. After 6 years, they have become used that we will not accept this kind of excuse. But at the beginning, we have a lot of discussions about that. If I release some kind of information, we always review what kind of information is. And in the study that I'm talking about, there is an analysis about requests and appeals related with public or national security. We will see what is people asking, how is the executive branch answering, and how is the file resolving. Of course, there are some information that is reserved, and we confirm the reserve. And what we find a lot in the study is that there are a lot of information that is supposed to be important for for public and national security, and actually the agency did not have this kind of information. As we will see, in terms of statistics, that's an special problem. The study covered 5 different institutions. I put the name in Spanish because it's so difficult to translate names of the agencies, but I will tell you what each one of them do. The Federal Police, the General Attorney Office, the Army. There is a special office that is supposed to gather information of public security from all the states, that it really is not very efficient, I must say, which is the Secretariado Ejecutivo del Sistema Nacional de Seguridad Pública. Among these 5 institutions, they have received over 5 years 21,500 requests, more or less. From those, there are, I put here, and I'm very sorry, 764 appeals. Actually, there are a little bit over 880 appeals, 890. In 764 appeals, as you see, there are relatively low, the number, it is relatively low, the number of appeals, 3.54%. In the other 122, they denied the information, there was an appeal, and we confirmed that the information should remain reserved. In the other cases, with different labels of openness, we have ordered to release some kind of information or part of the information, and many, many times public version of the documents. We try to order that they release a public version when it is possible to understand the document if you black out some parts. I mean, if from one document, let's put an example of 100 pages, there will be 90 pages blackout. we decide there is no public version. That in reality is a confirmation. The information must be reserved. If it is the opposite, then we try to do public versions. As you can see here, we have an increasing number, a constantly increasing number of requests. In the first years, we have 1,300 around, and in 2008, from January to August, we have 4,000 requests. We think this is happening because of two reasons. One, the law is working. The people is trusting that it's worth it to ask for information because most of the times you have information. And the other one, if you see in these 5 agencies, in the last 2 years, especially 2007 and 2008, it reflects the importance of the theme of national security and public security in the minds of the people. The war on drugs really makes the people aware that something is going on, and they have been posing a lot of requests about that. There you have, the appeals. There is an clearly increasing number of appeals. 2007 is really a benchmark in terms of security. It was the year that Calderon decided really confront the war on drugs. And this is more or less what is happening with the appeals that we received. The IFAI does not act by the only way that the IFAI acts when an information is denied is because the citizen posts an appeal. I mean, if the agency reserved the information and he or she didn't post an appeal, we have nothing to do. And we usually don't do anything. We don't have time, I must confess, even to review that. So if the people complain, is when IFAI really starts acting. We can have different kinds of answers to the appeal. We can modify the answer. That means we can release some part of the information, another part is secret. We can confirm with direction to warrant access. That means that many times in the process they say, okay, I do have the information, I will give it, but we order, you have to give it, not just tell to the IFAI that you are going to release the information. And we revoke, that means there is no information reserved here, and sometimes we confirm, of course. What is people asking? They ask mainly about administrative issues, a lot about statistics, and that's a big problem because either they don't have good statistics or they don't share statistics, as Sigrid told us. They ask a lot about public servants, and this is there are two kinds of questions. What is a public servant doing in the office? Or what kind of tests do you do about the public servants? Like, for example, clearance in terms of security that, as Sigrid told us, very few and public servants have a clearance. The other is about special intervention of the army and the police, which is operativos. The right word is not a special intervention. You told me it's a special operation, like when the police or the army goes, like, for example, to Michoacán or to Ciudad Juárez, and for 3 days or 5 days, they stay there and made some kind of actions. And a lot of questions about public figures. That's special about public figures in terms of to the general prosecutor or the general attorney about some kind of criminal investigations in a specific. One of the main findings that I must recognize is the lack of statistics in the sector. There are a lot of, there are no statistics that you can really trust. And many times they ask some kind of very generic statistics that you were supposed to have it, like how many women, how many men are in jail, what are their profile in terms of age, ethnicity, background, etc. And they don't have it and they don't like to give it. Another problem that becomes, I think, even worse with the political transformation in Mexico, when PRI is not the only party in power, is that states do not share information. They are very reluctant to send information to the federal government, and there is no kind of political or legal consequences if they do not share information. I remember very well one appeal where someone was asking for statistics for 2 years of the regular crimes, not organized crime, like burglary, homicides, and so on and so forth. And the Secretariado told us to defy, without no shame and without blinking, there is a problem. The governor doesn't like to share information. Because, for example, if this year is an electoral year in Nuevo León or in Querétaro, they won't like to send information because that can affect them politically. And we said, and what happens if they don't send information? Nothing. Legally, it doesn't happen, nothing. We tried to discuss with them, why don't you reverse and you publish the information systematically, and if it is an electoral year in Aguascalientes or Oaxaca, it doesn't matter, and the governor doesn't send the information, you make public that because of the election he's not sending the information. Oh, that's a very good idea. A very good idea that until now it hasn't been put in effect. So it was not such a very good idea, right? Among in the universe of the 700 appeals, in 111 appeals, they were asking statistics that they very candidly say, we are sorry, we don't have this kind of statistic. And it was very basic statistic. In those times, the resolution is, search again, try to find it. Sometimes they find some information. Sometimes they find general information that is not exactly in the way the citizen asked for it, but the citizen can manage the numbers and ask the specifics. But a lot of times they don't have the information. The study suggests is really the request and the appeals are changing in some ways. We have to be optimistic. The way the agencies are handling the information. We have several things that we really can assure they are changing. Like, for example, the General Attorney Office, the Procuraduría General de la República, and the Public Security Minister are changing things in their web pages. They are putting some kind of statistics. The Security Public opened a space called Focus Transparency, in which they start to release some information because there have several or many requests asking for the same kind of question, like, for example, data about the inmates in jails. and they are putting some kind of this information in the web pages, which is, I think, a good news, of course. What are the characteristics of the request that the people are asking? We can say that the people learn to ask very quickly. They are increasing in complexity year by year. Most of the requests suppose several issues and several documents. So even though there are just like 900, actually that means much more than just 900 documents. There is a kind of process, I call it press fulfillment, between the press and the questions. When there is a very important matter in the press, that triggered for the people to ask a lot of questions about this theme, and vice versa. When we start solving about a theme and special themes, you start seeing some kind of investigation journalists that gather several requests and information from the appeals, not just appeals, and all of a sudden it appears in one major newspaper, a very important piece of information that is gathering, it supposes several requests and appeals. Of course, when there is a special event, like, for example, the two accidents, one in Fox period and the other one now in Calderon's period, in which first the helicopter of Martin Huerta, which was former minister of Secretary of Public Security, died, and the other one in which the Minister of the Interior died, that supposed a lot of questions. One thing, and of course, about narco traffic and the war on drugs and all these special operatives. I think it's important that the people learn to ask for the same kind of question or the same kinds of themes to very different agencies. When there is something special, like, for example, the social conflict with the teachers in Oaxaca, they learn to do the same question to different agencies, and they are able to match the information. It is very sad to say that not a lot of times the response is coordinated or is consistent or coherent. And, of course, the press like to find this kind of incoherencies and talk about it. But that tells you some kinds of vulnerabilities in the national and public security system. Some of the cases that are related in the study that I think are important, like, for example, there was a huge legal dispute with Germany about between Germany and the army, the Sedena, about the industrial rights of the design of a special rifle, let's say, weapon. And because through the FI, they ask some kind of document about this special weapon, we release the information, and because they have the information of the weapon that was used by the Mexican army, the German company dropped the lawsuit because they saw that there was no reason really to argue that there was something to fight about it. This is a very important and interesting case. Let me see where. This is a very important and interesting case. One NGO in Nuevo León, near Monterrey, guided one NGO that specializes in human rights, teach to the inmates how to pose questions in order to see if they were able to file for parole and have like conditional liberty ahead of time, the first response of this agency of public security was, you don't have right to have that. We start talking with them and said, this is not public information, is the inmate who is asking, so they don't have the right to the information through public access, but they do have information through personal data, so you have to give them, and that makes a change in the way the ministry handled the information of those inmates. I think that was a very important case. The study ends here. Now, now I have to talk about some kinds of recent conflicts that we have had with the national security sector. One of the main problems is the lack of previous policies, as we already said, to handle reserved information. There is no gradation for different types of secrets. There is a huge problem about the absence of clearance and clear policies about the clearance to handle reserved information. I remember a very important case in which the information that someone was asking, we have no doubt, that was information that had to be reserved, very sensitive, and I have an audiencia in order to see the information, and the public servant came cross the whole Distrito Federal with the information, came to my office and said, really, Commissioner, this is a very sensitive information. And I say, I have no doubt. Do you have any idea how many copies are of this information? Because what you give me is a photocopy. No. Do someone in your office follow you in order to know that you don't stop at any Kinko's or whatever in Mexico is the equivalent and fax this information to someone? No. And I say, and I'm positive it's a sensitive information. It is very, very likely that if we release this kind of information, maybe the life of someone is in danger. So this is really a very sensitive problem in Mexico. On the other hand, we have that the authority is able to discretionally release pieces of information, and then they ask us to classify some information. There are a lot of cases in which the PGR or the federal police told us, please do not release this information. It's very sensitive. And we go through the internet to their own their own web pages and said, this is a pre-release of the ministry in which they release some information that you are asking us now to reserve it. That's really a source of conflict in our everyday life. Nowadays, after the war on drugs start, we are having a special conflict with the PGR, the General Attorney Office. The General Attorney Office, as most of you know, is in charge of what we call averiguaciones previas, criminal investigations before presenting someone to the judge. Before the war on drugs, there were a lot of requests about averiguaciones previas, criminal investigations, and justly when they were concluded, they fight always release some kind of information, protecting, of course, personal data, protecting other investigations related, and protecting all kinds of sensitive information. But there was, for the first time, the possibility of accountability in this part of averiguaciones previas, which is one of the most obscure parts of the prosecution of the crime and the administration of justice. Nowadays, after the war on drugs start, we really have a very big conflict with the PGR because they stop complying with the FI orders, even though we decide that you have to give a public version. They decide we are not going to obey, and let's see what happens. In FOIA, there is a very special power that the FI has, and I must recognize is special. Is stated in the law that our definitions are definitive for the public servant. That means if the commissioners of the FI decide this information has to be released, there is no second instance where they can appeal our decision. If we decide it has to be reserved, the citizen can go through the judicial system, but not the bureaucrats. Well, PGR decide, let's go to the judicial system and try to see what happened. They have contested, well, in this, from 2006, they try for the first time, let's not obey the FI and see what happened. In 2007, in 6 different resolutions, they decide not to obey. And in 2008, in 9 resolutions. As you can see, I know that the numbers are very tiny, sorry. As you can see, in 2009, the number goes back to 0. You may think now the PGR is obeying again. No, they changed the law. So we are now confirming that there is no way to release the public versions of the criminal investigation. The resolutions contested, there has been 13 different resolutions contested in the Tribunal de Justicia Fiscal Administrativa, an administrative tribunal. That's the easiest way to understand it. In the 13 times, they have rejected the appeal, and all the times they have give the reason, or they have said the FI is right and the PGR is wrong, but anyway they pursue the lawsuit. In January 2009, they reformed the penal code, and by this way they really put a very strong legal norm in order for us not to be able to open any kind of a criminal investigation. Actually, there is a constitutional review in the Supreme Court of that process. And just to close, we can say that from 2003 until now, freedom of information law is working in Mexico. People learn to ask. Public servants learn to answer. We must recognize that. People learn to appeal when they are not satisfied. But we have, of course, a part of big shadows in terms of national and public security. Our main concern now, I must say, are the criminal investigations closeness and the lack of statistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria and Sigrid. Let's open this up to a discussion. Before we do that, let me just recognize actually Katie Putnam, who was instrumental in putting this together, and Rob Donnelly, who I believe is back there as well, and Anna Alexander and Miguel Salazar, who are on either side here. So, and I saw Cindy Arzt, the director of our Latin American program, was around here as well. Yep. If you could give us your name, your affiliation, and launch into the questions, comments.
Paul Rich, president of the PSO.
Good to see you again.
And over the last 10 years, there's been a sharp acceleration of the sale of older archival documents which appear in America amongst antiquarian booksellers or by private treaty or even on email. In fact, recently a draft copy of the 1857 Constitution was sold by private treaty. It's obvious that the archival employees and bureaucratic employees would be very lowly paid. And this exodus of historical materials, collections, all kinds of materials from Mexico to Europe and to the United States, to private collections, and then hopefully into libraries sometimes, so at least they're saved or conserved, is itself worrisome. But doesn't it suggest if someone is willing to sell the 1857 Constitution, which would have some risks, that copying or destroying or otherwise dealing with the archival sources where there's very little notoriety, international notoriety. For example, a collection obviously looted from Mexico was sold recently of companions of Cortez, which was an extraordinarily interesting collection. And you can go on eBay and you can go on Google anytime and see all of these are for sale. Just look at the catalog, for example, of the Philadelphia Rare Book Company. And they've got all kinds of the patrimony of Mexico just for sale today. Doesn't this suggest maybe that the archives in general, the modern archives, are for sale, either to destroy or to make copies of, because the risks with that are less than with drugs. It's a quieter larceny and a quieter corruption.
One of you want to tackle that? Yeah.
Well, we must recognize that archives are a huge problem in Mexico, and you are absolutely right. There are very few people with the proper skills to have modern archives. When the Freedom of Information Law was passed in 2003, were supposed to pass other two laws, the National Archives Law, and also the personal data protection law. None of them have passed. If I has had a lot of trouble with the Archivo General de la Nación, trying to convince them that it is urgent to put some information in order. Of course, there are some kinds of corruption, but worse than corruption is chaos. And I must recognize there are a lot of chaos. We have had for 6 years a huge discussions with the Archivo General de la Nación, talking about the needs to state some public policies about electronic documents. There are no policies for public documents because they think historically, and they think the document is paper. Nowadays, for the federal administrations, most of the documents or most of the consignation of your everyday duties are on electronic, not on paper. And there are still no laws or not norms about how to preserve this kind of electronic documents. So, yes, you are right. The main problem that FOIA faces in Mexico is the chaos in the archives, and that means that someone can make a wonderful business or that no one can get the information.
Thanks. Other questions or comments? Margaret, and then Maureen. When we take both of you. Margaret here, and then Maureen, and then Dan. If we can take a round.
I'm Margaret Daly Hayes, and I'm teaching at Georgetown in the Industrial College on Mexico issues. First of all, I thought it would be useful to comment that Mexico's not alone in having problems with information sharing. I think the outgoing head of the office responsible for information sharing in the intelligence community here just testified before Congress that they're not doing such a good job. So this is hard. This is hard. I have two questions. With respect to the freedom of information, Maria, who is asking? Are the questions coming largely from NGOs and advocacy groups or individuals? Are they geographically located? And the second, more generally, with this whole problem of dealing with reserved information, sounds as if there's an issue about the training of the public servants in the management of information and so forth, and what is being done or contemplated in that area. Thanks.
Thanks. Maureen, let's do a round here, and then we'll come back to Maria and Sigrid.
Thank you. Maureen Meyer from the Washington Office on Latin America. I had two questions. One, actually, a clarification on the decision in terms of the reforms of the Penal Code and the PGR. When they seal criminal investigations, does that mean that the PGR isn't required to give even basic information on like how many averiguaciones previas they have, what cases are actually, how many people are sentenced? I mean, I think that kind of basic information is that no longer public in terms of the whole statistics issue of things. And then actually a question, as you mentioned, kind of the difficulty of having cooperation at the state level. How many states in Mexico have laws? I remember a few years ago, some laws were actually being passed at the state level in terms of freedom of information. What's going on with that, and does that actually put more legal obligations on these governors who don't want to be providing information?
And Dan, right next to you, or two doors down. Yeah.
Hi, Daniel Sabet. I teach in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I'm really thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, very useful and very interesting. I'm interested in kind of how EFI's standards have changed with the war on drugs. I mean, obviously, the Seguridad Pública, they want to release less information, but I'm kind of interested at how EFI has responded to that. I know in my own research, I've had people tell me in the Sistema Nacional things like, we've convinced EFI that, like, for example, the number of police in a police department, that's should be confidential, which seemed very surprising to me because that would seem like a very basic statistic that could be released. But the argument was you could if you knew how many police were there, and you could figure some things out, and that could be used by organized crime. And so I guess so I'm just kind of curious about how the criteria of EFI has changed with the current war on drugs.
Right. And also, if I can add a question in for Sigrid, though Maria mentioned this, but either one of you wants to answer this. The recent law that changed access to prosecution files, why did that come about, and how does that affect? I mean, what's the logic behind this? So, who wants to start? Maria, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Sigrid?
There are a lot of questions, which is good because I make you interested. That's fine. Let's see if I can tackle all of them. Who is asking? In general terms, not just in public security, let's say NGOs, lawyers, people from the press, and especially to the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social, which is the health institution, a lot of individuals, because they ask either for things about their own pensions or their medical records. Lawyers start to ask very quickly if they have any kind of lawsuit against the federal government. They learn to use the Freedom of Information law, and in general terms, not in terms of national security, a lot of questions about how the government buy procurement. And all the conditions and these kind of things. In terms precisely of national security, NGOs and other citizens, and that makes very reluctant to the public sector, because they say they must be narco-traffickants. You never know. And Mexico, you have the possibility, which is very strange but important for the law to work. You don't have to identify yourself to make a request. You can ask, saying, I'm John Doe, and we will have to answer. Either is public security or is salaries of the government or whoever. The idea is that if you are requesting public information and the information is actually public, it's public to everybody. It doesn't matter who are you or where are you. In terms of the training of public servants, for Freedom of Information Act, the IFAI have several programs, and we try to train in two different fields: how to respond and special requests, and the most important one, how to keep the information. We are really very, very behind, or as we say in Spanish, we are in diapers in this field. We hope we will grow on that. In terms, now I go over there. How many states do they have laws? All of them. Not all of them work, but all of the states have laws. In 2006, there was a major constitutional reform of the Article 6 in the Constitution, which is in that states that all the states have to have laws. They have to guarantee access to the information. It states at the constitutional level that the information is public by definition and reserved by exception, and that they have to have an electronic system so that people can ask information through internet. Up to now, there are like 10 states that already have the Infomex system. That means that you can post information through the internet from here or whatever part of the world, of course. We have signed an agreement with 30 out of the 32 states. That means that by the January or February of 2010, you will be able to ask information electronically almost to all the states as well as federal government, which I think is good news, of course. How the people asking the war on drugs. I think it's important first to have this idea. From 2003 until now, we have had around 500,000 requests, any kind of theme. In terms of national security, it's just about 20,000. So it's not such an important number, I think. And that's important to keep it in mind. What kind of information have we agreed to reserve? Some kind of statistics, but not general statistic. I mean, if they ask how many people are in the Policía Federal, we will release it. If they ask how many people went to the Operativo in Mazatlan, we will not release it. Or how many are in this kind of county or municipality, maybe just for federal police, we will not release it. But the general numbers, at least by state, we will release it. They ask and they put a lot of pressure to the IFI that we wiped out from the internet the names of every single public servant that works, for example, in the Procuraduría General de la República, or in the Policía Federal, or in the Ministry of Public Security. And with a very difficult process of negotiation and sitting in those round tables that the Sigrid were saying, we said there are some names that we cannot wipe out. I mean, everybody in Mexico, and I will say all over the world, but not all the world is aware, will know that the general attorney is Eduardo Medina Mora. It doesn't matter if you put it or not in internet. He is a public figure. You cannot take his name from internet. And there are several public, we went like backwards. We will just wipe out the people that is really doing some tactic and strategic work. Other people, we will not take it out from the web pages, and we will know his name, his rank, his salary, the electronic email, his email from the office, and all this kind of information. It has been tough. But I mean, we have been sensitive to some of this information, but not general or statistic information. And the reform of the penal code, it was a general reform. There was a reform trying to adjust the legal framework to make it more suitable to the war on drugs and the prosecution of the organized crime. But they were really very, very worried, especially about the criminal investigations. And they covered all the criminal investigations. Either they have to do with drugs traffic or not. And either they have to do with organized traffic or no. I think that this is a huge problem. I can tell you that there was once a special request, an appeal about a criminal investigation that had to be with electoral fraud that was referred to 2000, the election of Fox, Labastida, and Cárdenas. And the appeal was posed by two public servants of Pemex that were accused in the 2000 of lending some kind of buildings for Labastida. It was 2007, if I don't remember, don't forget. It was 2007 when the appeal came to the FI. The special office from prosecute electoral crimes was forget absolutely about this criminal investigation until the request and the appeal. They say, oh, we forget about it. Fox was already in his own ranch. Labastida is in the Senate, and these two public servants were suitable to have like some kind of order to be presented in front of a judge. So it's really a very serious question that we won't be able to have to learn about criminal investigations.
Thanks. Sigrid. And Sigrid, let me throw another tough question just to start some controversy here. How much is the lack of classification systems, the need to develop some of the infrastructure to really decide what is public and what isn't and what level it's reserved, how does that affect the relationship with the United States or other countries, Colombia, Central America, European Union, Interpol? I mean, the relationship, but particularly since Obama and Calder are sitting down on Sunday, to what extent is this an issue in terms of developing long-term cooperation on intelligence matters or policing?
I think that's yours.
Yes, but I want to comment on two that were dropped. The first one on training management of information. I think it is critical that we, as Maria said, we are in diapers on some of these things. Some of the areas have developed the training and the management of information. Some are completely new. Also keep in mind that some of the bureaucratic institutional building of the security apparatus is very new. So that means they are pulling in new people that at the same time, while some are in the operation, in the law enforcement, some others are becoming adjust to rules and regulations of managing information. And it is very important that leadership becomes aware of the relevance of preserving that information. But that goes a lot from the experience of the leadership that heads some of these agencies, and of the role that public servants in different levels of government play to it. For example, for me it was a very good surprise that I was going to get custody of a number of documents, because that meant for me that the team could go backwards and review the history of the National Security Council. And that was the case for the National Public Security Council, and that goes because information is being preserved. So at some point you will have public servants going backwards in history and reviewing what had been deliberated, what were the policy options taking place, and in others you would have new ways of preserving information for the future, or for scholars or for citizens that are requiring this information. So how to keep information, it becomes very critical. But keep in mind, this is a secretive sector. So they're very jealous about who has what at what moment in history. So we need to be very, very aware of that. And it comes all over the world. That's not only Mexico. We're in diapers. But U.S. has its own problems. Canada has its own problems. And they become very complex in sharing transnationally certain types of information. But I think that the more we engage societal actors, it becomes much more comfortable to learn why it is so important to preserve information, which takes me also to the comment on we need to be aware that public servants understand differently what they believe becomes public or not public. And I'll give you an example when we just recently started my responsibility. We, as public servants, are obliged by law to fill in our patrimonial assets, our personal assets. So you go through this electronic page and you're putting everything from you. Your bank accounts, your family address, all your degrees, everything. And there's a box that says if you want to release that publicly or not. The understanding is that, when questioning several public servants, is that if someone from outside wants and requested information, I have no problem. I'm comfortable with that. Okay? Others prefer not knowing or going into the little letters of the regulations, saying, no, I better disclose that. Okay. People in my team learned that all their information, their personal data, their bank accounts were being posted by the contractor office because they had marked that box. And these are persons that were not in an operational area, but they were having access to very sensible information that the security apparatus doesn't necessarily go all the way to protect their personal integrity, but that by knowing that they can become targets, given the degrees of penetration in some levels of government of corruption. So, by identifying people in my team that had honestly interpreted that if someone would come and ask from Juan Perez their information, he would be comfortable of giving that information, we realized going through the people on the bureaucracy that many understood that, and that there was information being posted of undersecretaries, heads of state, and that they had assumed a different thing. So it's very important that we also realize how new we are to this world of public servant responsibility, because that also puts at risk people. On the question of identity, in the particular case of our office, we had my name would be posted on the webpage, but because of the responsibilities I had, my image was not posted. And one of the reasons why I took the responsibility of saying that my image, my picture was not going to be posted was because after I would finish my responsibility, I wouldn't have necessarily the guarantees because of the state cannot go out and protect everyone, you know. So you take steps personally, and those are things that you arrange, you know. But as Maria says very clearly, if you are the head of the Attorney General, if you are the head of the Ministry of National Defense, these are public figures, no? But if you are in the operational part, and if you are doing and working with undercover people, and if you are gathering information that by knowing your identity you can become a target, because today it is a reality that you can become a target of organized crime, then you have to secure their identity. We have had all these dialogues, but you have to also strike the balance between making public those that are responsible and need to be held responsible to explain what was the decisions, the policies, and how to measure success, with that protecting the integrity of those that are at the operational level. And I think that by the dialogues that we produce in the security sector together with the FI and bringing new partners to this, we established a balance where everyone was becoming more and more comfortable of why this was relevant to each one's responsibility. The other thing, the thing of the statistics, I think that there's a new partner outside that very few people are aware of because of the autonomous stature that it obtained, which is the INEGI, the National Statistics and Geographic Institute, because they have a very, very long history of expertise in race and statistics. And it was in this administration that the INEGI obtain its autonomy, and they have a responsibility where they are building up what is known as the National Network of Information, which is to produce and disseminate information of national interest. That means that crime statistics are of national interest. But one of the exercise that the INEGI is doing is that they have to build and identify the skillful people that know how to gather that information. So we are starting to connect these different bureaucracies and areas of responsibility to produce the proper databases that have different asymmetries across the levels of government and within the federal government, but that are important because they are permitting us to get hard data, which is critical to understanding the differences. Now, posing your challenging question there, I think that it is, there's a double challenge. On the first hand, there's a challenge in the intra-world of the security apparatus because holding information, each one of the agencies, and that happens here in the U.S., it really happens in all the community, the security community across the world. Each one has the capacity to go out and gather certain information, no? And they have a piece of the puzzle, no? So what you first have to make to improve, because I don't think you get to the ideal world where FBI and CIA and then DHS will all share very comfortable information, because that's not going to happen. Well, that's not a reality, a wild dream.
They don't always share with each other.
Yeah. So imagine that. So let's put the case where you, in addition, have to go across your border and share with all these guys that you don't know and they don't even speak your language. So God, you have to translate that, no? So, but what works very well is that you are building bridges of trust on how we have come through the process of professionalization of our security apparatus. We have learned on both sides how we gather information, and we have proceed to standardize those gathering and systematization of information that we feel comfortable sharing on both sides. But obviously there will always be little pieces to it that you will not share because there are concerns on each side of how far you go on sharing, because that's the nature of the sector. But in contrast, on 10 years sitting at the Attorney General to today sitting where I had the privilege to be, the amount of moving along that road of sharing information, cross-boundary to achieve and tackling down common enemies has improved dramatically. But I think that you had stone blocks or critical moments like, for example, the Gutierrez Rebollo, because as in any security, sharing of information, trust, personal trust, plays a lot. And so in preserving that personal trust that goes together with institutionalization, that goes together with the career servant in the law enforcement on each side, makes everyone more comfortable, and I think we're going on that direction.
Okay, thanks. Jose Diaz Briceño, we'll go.
Yes, I'm Jose Diaz Briceño with Reforma newspaper from Mexico. I would love if you could share with us some ideas or comments about the dangers of using, well, I was talking to somebody yesterday about, on one hand, the PGR, the Attorney General's office, has been very secretive in not releasing any kind of, averiguación previa or prosecution files. But on the other hand, in these past 2 years, we have seen the PGR, the Attorney General's office, releasing to different newspapers different parts of the investigation. And it's not only the PGR, but also the Attorney General's at the state level. So many people in Mexico still are wondering, how does a real judiciary system works? And sometimes people in the general public, just by learning about the investigations, they assume these people are already culprits of crime. So can you comment on the dangers of using averiguaciones previas, release them to the public, specifically newspapers, as for political purposes?
Great. Let's do a round here, actually. Let's go around. Diana had her hand up. Why don't we do this side, and then we'll come over to this side next.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte at the Brookings Institution. I'd like to shift the discussion to the collection of information for investigative purposes carried out by SSP and collected within Plataforma Mexico. Can you share with us the nature of health documents and information on health issues that is permissible to collect and hold? And the same would apply in the tax area.
The what?
Tax area.
Tax.
Fiscal. Yeah. In the back.
Ted. Ted Wilkinson, Foreign Service Journal.
Good to have you here, Ted.
I have two questions. One, if I understand correctly, the maximum number of years that information can be protected under the current Mexican law is 24 years. Mm-hmm. And in our system, you can protect. Obviously, Mexico doesn't have any nuclear secrets. At least I hope not. But you can protect information of extreme sensitivity beyond that. Is that possible under any circumstances? If, for instance, CISEN has some special information it wishes to protect. First question. The second one is there is one constraint on access under our system. And that is that you have to pay for it, at least to some extent and in some circumstances. Mm-hmm. If you can prove you're an academic or a member of the accredited press, the fees go down substantially. That means that John Doe can't walk in and ask for information. Is there any cost to hold down the frivolous use of the FOIA privilege in Mexico? Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Can you guys hold several questions? Because we're getting near the end here. So you have John Doe. Let's go to John here.
John Dingus, Columbia University. Just a quick question. Is partial declassification
a common practice in the releases? The famous, I'm sorry, the partial declassification, is that common? The famous deletions and redactions that we have in U.S. declassifications? And is the system, you said there's not much of a system for the bureaucrats to classify their own information. Do they have a system of compartmentalization that would allow them to say in the area of criminal prosecutions, this kind of document is declassifiable, this other kind of document would not be declassifiable?
Who else? I saw other hands up on this side. That's a very high hand. Oh, why don't we go here, Mr. Inman?
Hi, I'm Harry Inman. I'm a lawyer. I'm very interested in the appeal process. Denial, in effect, is a judgment. It goes up to appeal. Supposing the appeal is not granted, do you have a right to an amparo?
Yeah. There was a hand high up in the corner, and then Katie also. Is that a hand? Oh, the high hand, and then Katie, you have the last question.
Hi, I'm Irene Martinez from the National Security Archive. For Maria Marvan, there's a provision in the Mexican law that says information regarding violations of fundamental rights cannot be reserved or classified. Do you think asking for averiguaciones previas that deal with crimes related to human rights violations could be this information could be released? And our second question is, we've been requesting information to Sedena, colleagues from the National Security Archive, and Sedena has been denying responses, saying that we are not Mexican citizens, or we don't live in Mexico, so it would be a violation of the Mexican Constitution that they respond to these requests. Have you received any appeals regarding other agencies denying information to people who don't live in Mexico? Thank you.
And Katie right next to you. Good to see you, Melanie.
Katie Putnam here at the Mexico Institute. And I have a question for Sigrid. You had talked about the need for external oversight and had mentioned the development of a commission in the legislature, sort of like an intelligence committee oversight. And I'm curious, given the limits on how long legislators are in Congress, that 3 years on the chamber and 6 years in the Senate, how these legislators are going to be expected to build up enough expertise to be able to oversee security matters. And then also a quick question for Maria. I'm curious how many of these, a follow-up question, how many of the requests are international? I remember seeing a breakdown a few years ago that most are from DF, then more from Estado de Mexico, and then a good percentage are international requests as well. Thank you.
Let's go back to our two panelists. We have about 10 minutes left. Sigrid, why don't you start?
Okay, I'll start with Diane's question on the collection of information on health and the tax area. I would guess that's on the information that they are gathering from their own public servants, the police officers, the law enforcement, just to have, or simply in general having access to that.
In general, having access to.
Well, one of the things that Maria was mentioning as a pending issue is that we don't have a law of personal data. We have to go into the discussion that the government has access to personal information, but it's collecting that personal information, but there's no guarantee that the state will use it correctly, lawfully, but that's a pending issue. That's a law that got stopped, that every time it's put forward on the floor, the debate becomes very politicized. It is true that there are concerns, for example, in the health sector, because even having all the information on your health history at the public health system could be easily released upon a request by the private insurance company and then be used against you. And so there will be the concerns of protecting that information are critical. I think that my impression, my very personal impression about why we haven't moved into the law of personal data is because no one has become a champion of the law in protecting the data, and that you have to find political actors that would prove the relevance that, okay, the state can gather information about you or through the IFE or your biometrics, or when you yourself become a public servant, but has to be lawfully controlled on the use that it has about your personal information. There are agencies that have been very good on doing these things, and there are agencies that, because they're in the building process, are not very good. But I think that one of the areas we should be heading is that we remain not having a law that would protect this data, and it's critical. It is critical for the common citizens, but I would add that it is very important for the public servants, because there's a number of information, especially in the security apparatus, that the state holds on you, and you have no guarantees that someone at some point will not use unlawfully that information and cannot be sanctioned. They know all your personal history when you go into these sectors, and so but you have to have a champion, and it's not out there. The other one that I would take is Katie's one on building up expertise. Well, this is a very recent thing, and the bicameral commission basically is 3 deputies and 3 senators, and the senators can hold a little bit more of history to keep track of it. One of the things we've identified, some of the senators have hired experts and do consultations sort of to keep learning more about the security apparatus, and that has given them an additional capacity to inquire those that are called upon hearings. That's for the senator part, but the body is breaking to 3 senators and 3 deputies. Deputies have little incentives there, but usually you would have members of the National Defense Commission, from the Navy Commission, from the Justice Commission, so they have in their background some area of expertise. I remember in one of the hearings I had, I would have a former military retiree that knew very well things on the national defense running for deputy in the PRI. And so his questions would be very specific. So I'll leave you the others.
Serena, did you want to try or no? Something on Serena.
Okay, about the political consequences that the PGRE disclose information, I already touched that point. I think it's... I mean, it shouldn't be happening. It is inconceivable that they release some kind of information, and then when someone asks for information, they say everything is reserved. They are really releasing information discretionally, and that shouldn't be happening. About the terms that you can protect the information, it is 12 years, but there is no limit how many periods of 12 years you can have. So it actually, the only thing is that you have to think again if really the reasons to be reserved are still valid or not. But you can have it 48 years, etc., 60 years. I think after 6 years of the law, we are really having problem with the frivolous questions. You have to pay the photocopies, but not the time for finding the information. And we must recognize, and of course, working at DeFi, I will defend the freedom of information law always, but we must recognize that we have some frivolous requesters. It has been very skillfully used by bureaucrats that has been fired, for example. And if I went out very angry with my boss, I will ask 100 questions and I will drive him or drive her crazy. And the legal means that we have to really screen this kind of questions are very little, because we just charge for the photocopy, and a photocopy is 50 cents of the peso per page. But sometimes, the The problem is finding the information, not really the number of photocopies. Sometimes, really, just when you said you have to pay for 200 pages, that's enough. To stop the request. Yes, there is partial declassification. We go to public versions, but what happened with the reform of the penal code in specific is that they decide there are not going to be partial declassification. The only case in what criminal investigation will be declassified is when there is no crime to prosecute, when the resolution is no acción penal. So that's what it is so important and so dramatic.
No penal action,
reform.
no criminal action,
not criminal
no
action.
criminal charges,
not criminal charges, and. Yes, you can appeal via amparo if I deny the information for some reason. You can go to the amparo, and that's when you go to the judicial system. We have had some very interesting fights with the judicial system. Sometimes about information related with national security, and sometimes with other information. As I said, lawyers and businessmen learn to use the law. You can follow very interestingly the fight among telephonic companies, and like Telmex has asked all the information of Avantel and vice versa, and all of them go to the amparo saying, I want information. Well, they don't say I want the information of the other company, but they go to the amparo saying, I don't want to release my information. It's, I mean, as matter of another table, and we can say, Andrew, that he can invite us.
Very good. Well, thank you to both of our speakers. Wonderful session. Really appreciate it, Sigrid and Maria.